The civilizations that humanity has built, each atop the innovations and discoveries of the past, have enabled us to achieve remarkable things. But those achievements have come at a price. Even though historians are traditionally interested only in the past and do not usually speculate about the future, it behooves us now to apply what we know of our past to understand what may be to come. Fortunately, millions of years of evolution have hardwired into the brains of humans and all other animals the ability to predict the future on some level, because our very survival often depends upon it. An animal heading for a drink at a waterhole must use all its senses to try and determine if there is a lion drinking at this same place, for example. And every time we try and cross a busy road, we are trying to predict the optimum time to do so. Humans have always tried to predict the future through astrology, tarot cards, crystal balls. We do it when deciding whether to pack an umbrella as we leave home, when betting on a horse race, or when investing in the stock market. But there is a special imperative today to try and think seriously about the future of our species and the various structures we have put in place to organize it. And that is that the decisions we make today will have a profound effect on the lives of our children, our grandchildren, and untold generations to come. Our big history exploration of the past and the themes of patterns within it we have identified has left us uniquely positioned to seriously consider the future in a way that was previously unavailable to our species. So let's try to project those trends forward and examine what may be our future at 3 different scales. In this lecture, the immediate future and the one in the middle distance, and then later, the most remote future for civilization that we can imagine. Of course, we must be very careful considering the future at each of these scales, because we know that nothing can be predicted with real certainty, even for the next century, let alone 1,000 years from now. The past is littered with failed predictions about the future. Consider some of the most important themes that we have explored previously: increasing complexity at all scales, Goldilocks conditions, the relationship between population growth and innovation, intensifying human impacts on the environment. All of these developments can be linked to the idea of Malthusian cycles. We have seen these cycles play out over and over again. Ever since humans made the transition to agriculture 10,000 years ago, populations have increased until they have inevitably outstripped the ability of innovation to feed, clothe, and house so many people, leading to famine, warfare, and decline. Another way of describing this is that human communities have repeatedly exceeded the carrying capacity of their environments to sustain them, leading to a crash. A pessimistic view of where we are right now in terms of a Malthusian cycle might suggest that we are heading for another widespread crisis, because the supply of fossil fuels that power our civilization seems certain to run out eventually. Moreover, these same fuels are leading to a dramatic deterioration in the climate of the planet that sustains us. We've also noted previously that the impact of humans on the biosphere since the start of the modern era has been so profound that many geologists believe that the Holocene era has ended. They say we have entered a new era, the Anthropocene, a period in which humans are the most powerful shaping influence on the planet, making impacts that will be felt for perhaps tens of millions of years. Many of these impacts are already apparent and will only intensify in the future. Destruction of habitat, species extinction, acidification of oceans, worsening erosion, and increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that are leading to global temperatures not seen here for millions of years. I realize this is a rather gloomy way to begin a lecture, but we do need to think very seriously about all these problems and possibilities. And there is room for optimism too, because of the very fact that the future has not yet been determined, and what actually happens is still very much up to all of us. Many voices are arguing that humans cannot continue with business as usual much longer, and that the structure of an industrialized society based on the burning of fossil fuels is no longer sustainable if our species and millions of other species are going to have a future. Some scientists have concluded that human societies are on the brink of catastrophic decline, the sort of decline that Jared Diamond identified in his 2005 book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. We have already considered the fate of many of the societies Diamond discusses, societies whose mistreatment of their environments made them ultimately unsustainable. Think of the Sumerians, the Maya, the Polynesian villages on the island of Rapa Nui, and so on. Is modern society also heading for the sort of Malthusian crisis that has doomed so many cultures before us? One of the most startling Malthusian trends that occurred in the 20th century is the dramatic fourfold increase in human populations. Now in the 21st century, the rate of growth is actually declining, although we are still doubling the world's population about every 58 years. This is the first time in the history of our species that the population has doubled within the lifespan of a single individual. Yet the slowing of this growth is undoubtedly good news. Current estimates suggest that human populations will be somewhere around 10 billion by 2050 and anywhere between a high of 14 billion and a low of fewer than 6 billion by 2100. In many countries, including India, Japan, Russia, and Germany, populations are already shrinking because of falling birth rates. In other countries, such as Lesotho and Swaziland, populations are declining because of rising death rates. By 2100, as a result of these trends, the location of the world's population will have shifted dramatically, with Europe's share declining to perhaps 6% and Africa's increasing to 25%. These changing percentages remind us that it is not just the total number of humans on the planet that determines our environmental impact, but also the lifeways and levels of consumption that various populations enjoy. Of critical importance in this context is our consumption of fossil fuels, particularly oil. How much is left? Will it run out before we have found an alternative? The most likely scenario is that oil will not completely run out. It will, however, require more complex, more costly methods of extraction in the future, making it much more expensive than today. Oil is an incredibly ancient resource, of course. In some places, the process that led to the creation of oil started 90 million years ago when tiny marine creatures mixed with sediment were compressed and heated. The Goldilocks conditions that allow this to happen are not that common, which is why oil formed in certain regions, such as the Middle East, and not in so many other places on the planet. As with all commodities in a capitalist economy, the price of oil is determined by a combination of supply and demand, and by the policies of oil-producing countries and cartels like the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. In the early 21st century, other countries, including the United States, using new extraction techniques such as fracking, have been able to increase the supply of oil, driving the price of oil down to record lows. How much longer this can continue is a matter of speculation, but given that oil and indeed all fossil fuels are finite resources, we know supplies will inevitably become more limited in the future. Back in 2002, the US National Intelligence Council offered 4 future scenarios for oil. Firstly, some technological breakthrough will dramatically cut oil use. Second, an ecological disaster will convince the public of the need to dramatically increase gasoline taxes to reduce dependence on oil. Third, oil will become so expensive that it will lead to a global economic depression. Or finally, revolutions in the Middle East will put in place governments that are not friendly to the West, and they will cut the supply of oil to Western nations. Some countries already tax gasoline use heavily, of course, both to reduce dependence on oil and to generate revenue to subsidize public transport and alternative energy research. The time is surely coming when all remaining fossil fuels will be too difficult to extract, and the longer humans wait to make this inevitable transition from fossil fuel to other forms of energy, the more chaotic and violent that transition will inevitably be. The other major problem with our dependence on fossil fuels is the effect it is having on the chemical constitution of Earth's atmosphere and the impact this in turn has on climates around the globe. Scientists have been warning since the 1970s that human emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere are creating a greenhouse effect, although many people, particularly many politicians, seem reluctant to accept this reality. We know from ice core samples that the level of CO2 in the atmosphere has varied over Earth's history, including during the time humans have been on the planet. During the Paleolithic era, CO2 was about 190 parts per million. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was 280 ppm. By the year 2010, it had risen to 390 parts per million, and by 2016, a mere 6 years later, this had risen to 403 parts per million, the highest concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in the past 650,000 years. Current estimates are that if CO2 emissions continue to increase at the current rate, levels will reach 550 ppm by 2050 and then double to 1,100 parts per million by 2100. The last time our planet experienced a concentration of 500 parts per million, caused by natural processes of course, was 50 million years ago when jungles grew at the North and South poles. The increase in the concentration of CO2 and other gases such as methane in the atmosphere has in fact created the greenhouse effect on the planet that scientists had predicted, trapping solar heat and leading to rapidly rising global temperatures. The US National Climatic Data Center reported in 2016 that the 4 warmest years recorded on our planet since data started being collected in 1880 were 2010, 2013, 2014, and the warmest of all, 2015. NASA is another US government organization that keeps a close watch on climate change data. Their website features a constantly updated set of statistics. NASA noted in 2016 that global temperatures are 1.4 degrees warmer today than in 1880, that Arctic ice has shrunk by more than 13% to the lowest extent on record, and that land ice is melting at the rate of 287 billion metric tons per year. The effects of rising temperatures and melting land ice will be felt all over the planet. Erratic weather and devastating storms will become more common, crop yields will be reduced, tropical diseases will spread more quickly, the oceans will become increasingly acidic, ecosystems all over the planet will be dramatically changed, and there will be significant rises in global sea levels, leading to increased flooding and the almost inevitable abandonment of many of the planet's coastal cities. It is as though the Earth is suffering with fever, and like the human body, each degree that our planet's temperature rises is increasing the threat to that organism's survival. Will it be possible for even the wealthiest countries to sustain living standards in the face of such an unstable and rapidly degrading environment? What will human civilization look like in the future as our descendants are forced to deal with a deteriorating planet and increasingly unsustainable ways of life? Global warming is surely the single most serious environmental threat that human civilization has faced since the end of the last ice age. But frankly, it is just the top in a long list of problems. Groundwater is being depleted and contaminated worldwide, and topsoil is eroding much faster than can be regenerated by geologic processes, leading to dust storms and the loss of farmland. Oceans are under tremendous stress from their absorption of excess CO2, making them acidic enough to interfere with the formation of external skeletons in marine life, shells and corals. Many fisheries are on the brink of collapse because of overfishing. Forests and the rich biodiversity they contain are being destroyed at an alarming rate in many parts of the world, converted to ranches and farms. Perhaps 50% of all species on Earth face the threat of extinction in the 21st century. Human activity has unleashed what biologists are describing as the 6th major extinction in the history of our planet. Our species is making demands on our planet's biosphere that are way beyond the capacity of the planet to sustain them. Essentially, we are devouring our own life support system by using the assets provided by ecosystems to pay for our unsustainable lifeways, and we are stealing these assets from future generations. We have seen previously how past conflicts between states and civilizations were often driven by the need to acquire more resources. Can we imagine what conflicts will look like in the future as the resources we depend on become increasingly degraded and scarce? As the situation worsens in the 21st century, how many nations will join the ranks of failed states, blighted by civil war, flooded cities, famine and disease, perhaps becoming fertile breeding ground for terrorists? So this is not a pretty picture. These negative impacts unleashed in the modern era suggest that our species is currently facing its greatest challenge since we first appeared on the planet about 200,000 years ago. But we have also seen that humans have repeatedly proven themselves remarkably adaptable when facing challenges, using our unique ability of collective learning to solve problems of staggering proportions. For example, we figured out how to survive in the ice ages, how to grow enough food to feed billions, and how to recover from disastrous pandemics and devastating global wars. Will collective learning help us find a way to deal with the huge challenges we face today? Are we already seeing signs of increasing awareness of what needs to be done and moves in the right direction? The fact that human population growth is slowing is surely one of the most hopeful trends, even though it is happening inadvertently rather than as a result of consensus and deliberate action. Projections suggest that our species will peak at somewhere between 10 and 12 billion. But stabilizing the climate of our planet will be a much tougher task. Some sort of climate change is now unavoidable. The only question is, how much change will our children and grandchildren have to deal with in their lifetimes? Substitutes for fossil fuels, the chief culprits in greenhouse gas emissions, are starting to emerge. Biofuels, wind turbines, solar energy, and thermal energy. But so far, none of these can provide anything near our current energy requirements. The introduction by governments of more subsidies for these emerging alternative energies, while at the same time increasing taxes on gasoline and automobiles, might create strong incentives to help speed up the transition, but many do not have the political will to even consider this right now. We certainly have the technical knowledge to generate enormous amounts of energy using nuclear reactors, but we have yet to figure out how to store radioactive waste long term. And the security of nuclear plants and the material they contain, particularly in an age of terrorism, remains a critical problem. A heartening sign is the increasing cooperation we have seen over recent decades between nations on dealing with environmental problems, an example of the transformative power of collective learning. Perhaps you can recall just how quickly the global community was able to act back in the 1980s when it realized that chemicals known as chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which were being used in refrigerators and air conditioners, were causing damage to the ozone layer. A conference was convened in Vienna in 1985 to address the problem, and 2 years later, 31 nations signed the Montreal Protocol, an agreement to phase out the production of CFCs. Since then, CFC production has dropped dramatically, and the ozone layer is slowly repairing itself. This encourages many to believe that alternative sources of energy or new methods of mitigating the effects of burning fossil fuels will help humans limit the consequences of global warming. There is also much more careful monitoring of the impact of our species on the planet these days, as a variety of organizations like NASA track the dimensions of our environmental footprints on forests, freshwater, and marine ecosystems, and propose strategies on how to reduce these impacts. Critical for the survival of species, including humans, is maintaining supplies of fresh water and healthy soils. This, you'll recall, is demonstrated unambiguously by the early examples of Jericho and Anau, and the demise of several civilizations for lack of these resources in later millennia only reinforces the point. So we see a proliferation of water recycling systems, the creation of genetically modified crops that will need less water, reduction of the numbers of animals permitted to graze per acre of grassland, the banning of clear-cutting of forests, and so on. Recent attempts to protect the oceans have led to the establishment of huge marine reserves and the reduction of toxic chemical runoff into the oceans. To slow the rate of species extinctions, many nations have created national parks, wilderness areas, and protected preserves. Something like 11% of the total land surface of Earth is now protected in national parks and nature preserves. Great strides are also being made in many countries to reduce energy consumption and recycle waste materials. One example of reduced energy consumption is the proliferation of compact fluorescent lamp bulbs, CFLs, which use 75% less electricity than incandescent bulbs and last 10 times as long. Light-emitting diodes, or LEDs, are even better, using 85% less energy and lasting 50 times as long. Many of our household appliances are now much more efficient than just a few years ago, especially refrigerators, although the proliferation of large-screen plasma TVs, which use 4 times the electricity of traditional cathode ray tube TVs, is a problem. Other positive trends include the global proliferation of more energy-efficient green buildings and the increase in the sustainability of many public sector industries such as transport. Personally, I ride a hybrid bus to work at my university almost every day. Recycling is another positive development because this allows us to reduce the use of virgin raw materials and replace the throwaway economy that many of us grew up in. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, in 2013, the United States generated about 254 million tons of trash, but we recycled or composted about 87 million tons of this, or about 1/3, which is a tremendous improvement compared to just a decade earlier. The modern world is incredibly urbanized compared to all the earlier periods we've considered in this course. Today, roughly 50% of the world's population live in cities. Tokyo remains the largest city on the planet with a population of almost 38 million, followed by Delhi with 25 million, Shanghai with 23, and Mexico City with 21 million. In all, 20 cities around the world have populations of over 10 million people. Isn't it incredible to think back to the very first cities that appeared on Earth in Sumeria more than 5,000 years ago? What a triumph of human ingenuity and social adaptability that we have seen these urban centers grow to such staggering proportions of size and complexity. Of course, these megacities have to deal with enormous problems of maintaining clean air, water, and sewage infrastructure, crime, traffic, and so on. Yet even in these huge cities, we see great strides being made, special pathways for cyclists and pedestrians, and huge improvements to public transport systems to cut back on private automobile use, for example. Urban gardens are proliferating in cities, producing more and more food and decreasing our carbon footprint at the same time. Currently, somewhere between 25 and 30% of all Americans grow some of their own food in backyard gardens. These are all positive examples of the way our species is responding to the challenge of reducing consumption to preserve our environment and hopefully mitigate the impacts of global warming for current and future generations. The Industrial Revolution, sparked by the burning of coal, transformed our world in so many ways, and these transformations dramatically intensified in the 20th century. Now, in the 21st century, humans all over the planet have realized the dangers the Industrial Revolution unleashed and are doing whatever they can to preserve our ecosystems for our other species, for ourselves, and for future generations. Are there political ramifications in this also? As we have seen, humanity has experimented with numerous types of governance and administration throughout the history of civilization. What might future governments dedicated to preserving the environment through more sustainable practices look like? David Korten thinks about this carefully in his 2006 book, The Great Turning: From Empire to Earth Community. As he sees it, our choice of governance will be a critical factor in determining whether or not we survive. We have watched the development of empires over 5,000 years, ever since Sargon of Akkad managed to defeat the other cities of Sumeria and place them all under his control. He established a hierarchical and coercive power structure based on the use of force to dominate large populations of humans for the first time. David Korten contrasts empires with what he calls an Earth community, a more egalitarian and democratic system of human relationships based on the idea of cooperation and partnership. Korten sees two possibilities for future governments. There will either be a great turning in which humans demand stronger participatory democratic institutions and greater cooperation, or there will be a great unraveling in which our environment collapses and human communities are plunged back into a period of violent conflict over dwindling resources. Such conflict, he writes, would lead to massive loss of human life, the breakdown of democracy and of the nation state, political fragmentation, and the appearance of ruthless regional warlords. These choices raise fundamental questions about human nature. Are we essentially driven by violence and greed to construct imperial societies based on a ruthless social Darwinist competition for power and treasure? Or are violence and greed just parts of human nature, tendencies tempered by instincts of cooperation, empathy, love, and self-sacrifice for the greater good? If so, they might give our species unlimited potential not only to survive the looming crisis, but to go on and achieve a whole new conception of what it means to be human and to live in communities that are in harmony with other humans and indeed with all other species on the planet. The choice is stark. Are we heading for a new age of violence and brutal dictatorship, or of harmony, deeper democracy at all levels, and a transformation in our attitudes towards each other and the planet? Surely there is reason to hope here too, as we look back on decades of strong international cooperation through organizations such as the United Nations, which despite its flaws demonstrates what can be achieved through cooperative, genuinely global, collective learning. We see clear evidence of global cooperation in the work of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, from the very first conference it convened in Berlin in 1995 through to the 22nd gathering in Paris in 2015. Conferences that have led to the signing of major international climate treaties between large numbers of nations. It is not just global governments that are aware of the challenges facing us. There are also many non-governmental organizations that are investing heavily in effective solutions. In addition, many wealthy philanthropists are increasingly directing their resources to climate, health, and social causes, including George Soros, Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett, and Mark Zuckerberg. All these developments, not to mention the way in which the internet has utterly transformed and intensified our capacity for collective learning, are surely hopeful signs that through global cooperation, we may yet avert a great unraveling. Yet nothing about the future is certain. As we look around the world of the early 21st century and try and imagine the world 100 years from now, how optimistic should we feel about the ability of our species to mobilize the political will to rapidly make necessary changes in a managed way before a crisis is upon us? It is the economic and political system of capitalism that has led the world into the modern era, and it remains the most powerful, transformative tool available to us today. With the assistance of nudges in the right direction from governments, will the decisions humans make today through the marketplace force the capitalist system and the multinational corporations that govern it to move rapidly away from unsustainable, harmful, gas-guzzling products and towards more environmentally friendly and sustainable alternatives? What can all of us do today and over the next century to modify our personal lifestyles to encourage positive trends? How many of us will change our habits by conserving energy, purchasing only sustainable products, reducing our dependence on the automobile by walking and cycling and using public transport, and growing more food in our own backyards? If we do so in large numbers, will it make enough of a difference? Big History offers us all the perspective to glimpse our rapidly changing world with greater clarity, creativity, compassion, and courage, and to realize that, unlike the societies Jared Diamond explores in his book, the future of this current human society is still very much in our own hands. This reminds me of a cartoon I saw once in which a man has gone to a fortune teller and asked her to look into a crystal ball and tell him about his future. After a few moments of peering into the ball, she says, "Actually, sir, I can't see a thing about the future. It's all up to you." Scary, isn't it?